opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to questions. And we start. Thank you. We now come to question 1. Beth Winter.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 1, 12 and 15 together. We are doing all we can to increase aid into Gaza. With our allies, we will take decisions on the future of UNRWA funding after scrutinising Catherine Colonna's interim report on UNRWA neutrality.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have heard this morning some shocking reports regarding Palestinian medical staff in Gaza being blindfolded, detained, forced to strip and repeatedly beaten by Israeli troops after a raid on Nasser Hospital last month. There's footage from Khan Yunis showing men stripped and kneeling, and it also shows patients with their hands bound being wheeled in beds. So does the UK government believe that the Israeli government is responsible for the conduct of its forces and that this clearly appears to be torture and is in breach of international law, including Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention Article 18? And what is the UK government going to do about this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, she is right to say that Israel must comply with the Geneva Convention she mentioned. We have seen these reports. I think that a full explanation and investigation is required, and that is what the British government is pressing for. And I would point out to her that when it comes to targeting operations, there are lawyers embedded in the Israeli and the IDF command, just as there are in Britain, and that should ensure that the acceptance and honouring of international humanitarian law is kept. But I agree with her, a full explanation is required.
Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months we've seen the horrifying images of children in Gaza mutilated or killed by bombing. Now we see them starving. Aid by air and sea is welcome, but it's insufficient and it's a diversion from Israel's responsibility. Yesterday, 12 Israeli human rights organisations called out their own government for failing to comply with the International Court of Justice ruling to facilitate access for humanitarian aid. Does the Minister agree that the Israeli government should be told by the UK and our allies to unlock aid and end the killing or face real consequences?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as he knows, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have both pressed Prime Minister Netanyahu and indeed President Herzog to ensure that more aid can get into Gaza. And as he will also note, it's the policy of the British government to do everything it can to achieve a pause so we can get the hostages out and more aid in and move towards a sustainable ceasefire. And we are doing everything we can to try and achieve that.
Alicia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we are seeing in Gaza is a starvation-level event. The US has taken a desperate measure of airdrops and flotillas which don't direct aid like land-based aid. The only organisation big enough to fully distribute aid to avoid starvation is UNRWA. 100%. Canada reviewed the interim report of the UN Office of Internal Oversight Service and has resumed funding. Sweden have received bilateral assurance of the same actions the FCDO is supposedly looking for from UNRWA and resumed funding. It's scandalous the UK government position is still a suspension of funds, despite the interim report and without evidence being provided by Israel in the first place running. The British public don't want to be responsible for starvation in Gaza. When is the Minister going to resume the funding?
Minister.
Well, as I have told the House before, there is no British funding due until April, and enough funds have now come forward in order to ensure that adequate supplies are available. And we are awaiting the report of the UN Office of Internal Oversight and Catherine Colonna, the former French Foreign Minister's interim report, and the view that we take is that when we have seen those, we very much hope we will have the reassurance to recommence funding. That is also the position of the United States, Germany, Australia, Italy, Finland, Netherlands and Switzerland, and I hope that he will be comforted by the fact that we are very much trying to resolve this matter as speedily as we can.
Show the Select Committee, Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Foreign Affairs Committee recently returned from Al Arish, which is the staging point for aid into Gaza. It was very difficult to see thousands of trucks on that border. The government has been clear that Israel has a legal obligation to ensure aid reaches civilians. The last legal assessment took place at the end of last year. So can my right honourable friend tell the House in legal terms, is Israel demonstrating a commitment to international humanitarian law? And if he won't tell us in this House, will he please write to me?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her visit with the Select Committee and for her comments. We are quite clear that Israel has the capacity and ability to abide by international humanitarian law. We review it on a regular basis, but as of today, that remains the position.
Theresa Villiers.
Mr Speaker, the UN mission team that recently visited Israel concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred in multiple locations during the 7th of October attacks. In the light of that appalling and shocking conclusion, will the government redouble its efforts to get the hostages home because they might be suffering a similar fate to those victims on the 7th of October?
Minister.
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend, and she will know that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and Lord Ahmed have all met the families of the hostages. I had the privilege of meeting some of the families last week. The second occasion I have done so within the precincts of this House of Commons. She is right. We are doing everything we can to increase the flow of aid and get the hostages home, and we will continue to do so.
Miriam Kate.
Of the 7th of October massacre was the fact that many ordinary Gazans, reports indicate hundreds or even thousands, followed the Hamas terrorists into Israel and participated in the atrocities. And reports suggest that civilians kidnapped Israelis and sold them to Gaza-based terrorist groups and committed further unspeakable acts of violence and sexual violence. Is my honourable friend aware of those reports? And does he share my concerns at Hamas's ongoing indoctrination of ordinary Gazan citizens?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point. I am aware of those reports. The fact remains that the appalling events of October the 7th were, as I've said in the House before, the worst atrocity, the worst killing of Jewish people since the Holocaust and the Second World War. And we continue to want total accountability for the terrible events that took place on that day.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Accepting what the Minister says about there being no money due to go to UNRWA until April, can I say to the Minister, however, that for us to continue not to fund UNRWA sends a truly dreadful signal to other countries on the world stage. Canada and Sweden have resumed their funding. Surely we should be attending to this now as a matter of some urgency.
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I listed the countries that take the same view as us. He is right that there is a division, but for Britain, we are not due to provide any funding now until we reach the next financial year in April. And we will, of course, seek to do everything we can to resolve this matter by the time that funding is due.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Deputy Foreign Secretary confirm that Israel is cooperating with an increasing number of lorries entering Gaza carrying essential humanitarian aid? I've been looking up the figures. 16,405 aid lorries, 203,300 tonnes of food, 26,160 tonnes of water. Isn't it correct that the Israelis have said there's no limit on the amount of aid that can come in, but there is an amount of delay once it's past Israeli checks before it gets into Gaza proper?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable and learned friend is right to say that there has been an increase in the number of trucks getting in. In February, only 97, and on average, and in March, 162. So there has been an improvement. But the House will recognise there is nothing like enough getting through. The easiest way is to do so by truck and by road. It is because that is so difficult that we have had to find other mechanisms, such as the maritime and the air routes.
Shadow Minister Alicia Nandy.
Can I
referring back to the serious allegations from today's BBC investigation that medics in Gaza were detained, stripped and beaten whilst attempting to conduct their life-saving humanitarian duties. All of us in this House have repeatedly called on all parties to abide by international law. But the Government has so far declined to say that the ICJ provisional measures should be implemented in full. Will he now tell us that they should? And that the UK will support the ICC investigation led by Andrew Cayley to ensure all allegations against all parties are not only investigated, but that there is accountability for those who break the law.
Well, she is quite right that there needs to be a full and thorough investigation and accountability for what was reported today by the BBC, and I can assure her that the Foreign Office is pressing for full transparency and accountability in that matter.
Alicia, Nandy.
Surely he can see the problem. Unless the ICJ provisional ruling is implemented and the ICC is allowed to go about its work, those words are simply meaningless. Unless the international community is crystal clear that rules will be upheld by all parties and those who don't will be held accountable, more people will die. Peace is built on the bedrock of international law. So can I ask him again to be clear with this House that the Government will support the ICC investigation into Hamas as well as into Israel and will press for the ICJ provisional ruling to be implemented in full, and that international law will be upheld not when it is convenient but always as the precondition to peace?
Well, let me be very clear about that. We did not believe and do not believe that the ICJ referral is helpful in trying to secure dialogue. We respect the role and independence of the ICJ and we will consider any advisory opinion. We did not think it helpful, without the consent of both parties, for the court to deliver an advisory opinion on what is essentially a bilateral dispute. But we keep all these matters under review, and as I say, our current position is that we believe Israel has both the capacity and intent of abiding by international humanitarian law.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
The Minister will have seen the shocking images of parachutes dropping aid into Gaza at the same moment as a barrage of Israeli missiles struck. There is, of course, every chance that both the aid and the missiles originated from the same source. And I wonder at the level of cognitive dissonance required to supply aid to innocent civilians while at the same time providing the means by which Israel can continue to indiscriminately kill them. So when will this government recognise the moral absurdity of selling weapons to Israel while attempting to salve its conscience by airdropping aid to those civilians fortunate enough to have survived that bombardment?
Minister.
Well, I have mentioned, I think, to the honourable gentleman before that in this country we have the toughest arms control mechanisms anywhere, but we accept that Israel has a right of self-defence. And it has to be seen through that prism as well as the prism through which he sees it. But I can tell him that we continually keep these matters under review. That is not only international humanitarian law, it is also the arms export regime, and we will continue to do so.
Ruth Jones.
Question 2, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 2 and 14 together. We must generate momentum towards a permanent peace with an immediate humanitarian pause leading to a sustainable ceasefire.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his comments. We all want to see, everybody in this House wants to see a negotiated diplomatic agreement to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on 2 states. But would the Minister agree with that the first step to achieving this is an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the release of all hostages?
Minister.
Well, the problem with calling for an immediate ceasefire is neither side want to have one, and therefore it would be in my view, it would be an unhelpful intervention. That is why the British government and other governments too have called for a pause to get the hostages out and get aid in, which can then lead and be built on into a sustainable ceasefire, and that is what we are seeking to do.
Reg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ideal of a two-state solution is one that unites this House. However, there are practical barriers, not least that Hamas are surging in what polls there are across the Palestinian Authority, and that the Palestinian Authority themselves continue to have hateful preaching in the school curriculum that is breeding the sort of hate that leads to evil organisations like Hamas having a grip in Gaza, and they continue to pay salaries to convicted terrorist families. So if we're to get a two-state solution, that needs to stop, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Minister.
Well, in respect of the textbook allegations which he made, I have received those allegations, and I had a meeting with the head of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini, last week, where I presented him with this evidence and asked for a full account. In respect of the two-state solution, let me be clear that both within the Israeli government and within civil society throughout Israel, there are pragmatic voices which believe in self-determination for Palestine as the only way forward. And it's very important that we try and build on that vision, and that is why the Foreign Secretary is so committed to trying to bring people together so that when the political track can open, it has real substance to it.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that the two-state solution becomes more difficult when Israel has constructed over 700,000 illegal homes in the West Bank, and it continues to do so with the backing of the IDF, with the backing of the Israeli government? We see images even now of people being turfed out of their home and people coming and taking over, and illegal settlement homes are being sold in the USA to people to buy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are things that we want the Israeli government to do in that respect. We want them to release frozen funds, we want them to halt settlement expansion, and we want them to hold to account those responsible for settler violence. And that is why Britain has sanctioned 4 extremist Israeli settlers. But let me be clear, the Israeli government, as I understand it, Mr. Speaker, is not against Palestinian statehood, but is against unilateral recognition without bilateral negotiations. That was the burden of a vote in the Knesset on the 18th of February this year.
Paul Scully.
Mr. Speaker, we see the discussion of a two-state solution wider outside this place as being misrepresented, where restaurants are having their are being boycotted because of selling Coca-Cola. Because despite the fact that they think they're supporting Israel. The Coca-Cola factory in the West Bank is actually owned by a Palestinian franchisee. So we need to educate people. Now, can we, to get back to the discussion of a two-state solution, we clearly need a ceasefire. We clearly need that early stage has to have the release of the hostages by Hamas. Can my right honourable friend detail what discussions he's having in that regard?
Well, these discussions, Mr. Speaker, are going on all the time with our friends and allies, with the regional powers, at the United Nations, and indeed directly with Israel, which, as I said, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary talk regularly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And we will continue to try and do that. He very eloquently set out the reason for the government's policy of trying to create this pause to get the hostages out and aid in, and we will continue to pursue that objective.
Shall Mr. Wayne David?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in Gaza is truly appalling, but the situation in the West Bank is also cause for huge concern. Since the horrific 7th of October attacks, over 400 Palestinians have been killed and thousands have been detained. Further to my honourable friend's question, last week Israel advanced plans for 3,400 new homes in the occupied Palestinian territory. As a two-state solution is the only path to a lasting peace, then does the Minister agree that a firm position must be taken now by the United Kingdom and the international community on these issues?
Minister. I hope very much, Mr. Speaker, that I set out what is broad agreement with what he said, that the steps that Britain wants to see taken against illegal settlements and against those settlers who have committed crimes, we want to see them arrested, tried and punished for those crimes. And in respect of the Palestinian Authority, we want to see the Palestinian Authority reinvigorated and with new leadership and a strong approach to taking up the roles that it will need to do when the sky clears and there is a moment for the political track to begin.
Sir Desmond Swett.
Number 3, sir.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3, 13 and 18 together. We need a humanitarian pause to get aid in and hostages out, leading to a sustainable permanent ceasefire. We are pressing for this with Israel, regional leaders and our wider international partners, including the United States.
Sir Desmond.
Given the importance of its role, the Palestinian Authority will require thoroughgoing reform, won't it?
Well, he's right, Mr. Speaker, and that is why both the Foreign Secretary and the noble Lord Ahmed have been in discussions with the Palestinian Authority and with the wider regional community to try and make sure that when the moment comes, as I set out in my response to the honourable gentleman just now, when the moment comes, the Palestinian Authority are able to seize it.
David Dewey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that an unsustainable ceasefire which rapidly collapses would only make it more difficult to build the confidence needed or required for peace, and that a humanitarian pause now, as well as getting more aid in and hostages out, could help to bring about the conditions required for a sustainable ceasefire?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend has put his finger on a critical point, Mr. Speaker. We do not believe calling for a general and immediate ceasefire works, hoping it somehow becomes permanent. A ceasefire won't last if the hostages are still being held. You can't just will it, and neither side, as I mentioned earlier, wants it, and the conditions need to be in place for it not to collapse within days.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of these answers. Toughest arms licence regime. We've urged Israel to follow international law. The same meaningless supine nonsense week after week and month after month from this government. I've said many times that it sickens me that this government, indeed the Labour front bench, have called out the war crimes of Putin in Ukraine at light speed, but prevaricate in doing the same on the Israeli bombardment and siege of Gaza. It sickens me that this government has abstained on previous UN Security Council ceasefire resolutions. Given the will of this House, will he guarantee that the UK will work with partners and draft a resolution that reflects the will of this House and finally vote for a ceasefire to end the suffering of so many in Gaza?
Minister.
Well, on his final point, which I think was the question, the answer is yes, but in respect of everything else he said, the answer, Mr. Speaker, is no.
Mr. Speaker, women in Gaza are giving birth without even having a chair to sit down. They're having caesareans without medication, and the Minister will know that many aid agencies have repeatedly called out the horrific suffering now of the Palestinian people and Israel's unacceptable restriction on aid flows. So could I press the Minister, because we have been talking about the urgency of an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, could I press him on how urgently the government is actually pushing for this with both sides and with partners in the Middle East, not just on the urgency of a ceasefire, but also on a plan for what comes next?
Minister.
I can reassure the Honourable Lady that on both those 2 points, pressing for a pause and also pressing all the regional powers on what comes next, the government is actively and continually engaged. And on her first point about the terrible plight of women, which she identified in Gaza, that is why the British government, just a week or so ago, gave nearly £5 million specifically to try and do something to alleviate the desperate circumstances in Gaza, which so many women find themselves in.
SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the best way to deal with a sustainable ceasefire is obviously to deal with the ongoing humanitarian crisis, and the best organisation to do that is UNRWA, not individual bilateral actions. Now, the Minister mentions states that have suspended their funding, and that's evolving really fast. The EU has just announced £50 million for UNRWA, with 2 further tranches of £16 million subject to the satisfactory completion of an audit. Now, I take the point that no funding is due from the UK to UNRWA until April. What further reassurance does the UK need to make sure that funding will be in place? Because UNRWA is the best organisation to disperse it, and the UK risks being very much on the wrong side of these developments.
I don't agree with his last point. It is true that Canada, Sweden, Spain and the EU, with conditions, expect to be able to resume. But as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, America, Germany, Australia, Italy, Finland, Netherlands and Switzerland take the same view as us. But to the substantive point he makes, we are in discussions with the leader of UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini. We are awaiting the report from the former French Foreign Minister. We are awaiting the report from the UN. And we hope that as a result of those reports, sufficient change will be secured that we can continue to fund UNRWA. But he should be in no doubt that we have fully funded UNRWA into the next financial year.
Tom Home.
Question 4, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're engaging with international partners on a whole-of-route approach to addressing irregular migration, and this includes a multi-year operational plan with France to stop small boats, developing partnerships to tackle organised immigration crime and improving returns processes. And we're working with partner countries through a number of international fora to address those root causes.
Tom Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, small boat crossings continues to be a massive concern for my constituents. And also, many have pointed out to me there's some logic to the argument that actually if those who illegally entered our country from France, which is of course a safe European country, if they were returned on the same day, then overnight the problem would probably be dealt with. Does my right honourable friend, has she discussed this with her counterpart in France? Is her counterpart open to this undeniable logic? And if so, why don't they accept them back on the same day?
Mr. Speaker, my friend raises a point that I think is raised with many of us through our postbags, and the reality is that individuals in need of international protection should claim asylum in that first safe country that they reach. This is always going to be the fastest route for safety for them. But we are, of course, continuing to work collaboratively with our European partners, including France, to address those shared migration challenges. And I can update the House that our partnership with France has helped bring down small boat arrivals. Together, we stopped over 26,000 crossings last year.
Jim Shetland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for that response? Minister, we obviously in Northern Ireland have a border with the Republic of Ireland, so can I ask the Minister this question? What discussions has the Minister had with her counterparts in the devolved nations, and particularly the Northern Ireland Assembly, and with the PSNI in relation to tackling illegal migration, ever mindful that we have a land border which needs patrolled and policed?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we continue to engage across a number of international fora, as I've said, to strengthen that collaboration, to make sure that we're working to have secure and ambitious partnerships in order to tackle this irregular migration. I will ensure that my colleague updates him on the specific meetings that they've been having with the PSNI.
Question 5, sir. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and I regularly speak with our ministerial counterparts on a range of issues, including the war in Ukraine. Last week, the Foreign Secretary met Foreign Minister Baerbock to reaffirm our commitment to supporting Ukraine at the UK-German strategic dialogue on the 7th of March in Berlin.
I thank my honourable friend for his answer. He will be aware that the head of the Luftwaffe, Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhardt, made an appalling lapse of security, which the former Director General of German intelligence, August Hanning, said that NATO security and British troops have had their existence in Ukraine compromised. Does he agree?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate his motivation for asking that question. I think what we should keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that our relationship with Germany in regard to our support of Ukraine is strong and united, deeply cooperative, and together we are delivering the fighting edge that our friends in Ukraine need.
MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that was ringing in my ears after a recent visit to Ukraine is not just frustration with what's happening in the US, but even those European countries, Germany, the UK, France and others, who are a yes on weapons support. It's the slow yes that is frustrating people. What is the Minister doing to turn that slow yes, for example, on Taurus, into a quick yes, but more broadly, doesn't it make the case for a comprehensive defence agreement between Britain and the EU?
No, it doesn't, to answer that question directly, but what we are doing is continuing to work very energetically and closely with our friends right across Europe, including at the recently convened French summit, to ensure that the heft and military capability from all of its allies are brought to increase its fighting edge.
Mr. Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our defence, security and foreign policy relationship with Germany is critical, not least in relation to our united and mutual support for Ukraine. And I will be meeting German counterparts on these issues in Berlin this week. Could the Minister give us more detail on the discussions he and the Foreign Secretary have had with German counterparts on three issues: urgently speeding up and expanding delivery of weaponry, secondly, bolstering our diplomatic coalition, and crucially, utilising frozen Russian state assets across Europe to pay for urgent needs to support Ukraine?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. He asked a characteristically intelligent and pertinent question. We are working together to increase the defence industrial capability, and there are some new ideas that have come out of the French summit in terms of increasing domestic capability for our Ukrainian friends. A lot of diplomatic support goes into that. And when it comes to frozen assets, he will have seen recent thinking from the European side with regard to using the interest payments from those funds. So that's something that we will consider. We do need to find a reliable legal route if it's to be sustainable.
Bob Seeley.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the UK has consistently condemned Vladimir Kara-Murz's politically motivated conviction and called for his release. We have sanctioned 11 individuals in response to his sentencing, as well as 2 individuals involved in his earlier poisoning. We regularly raise his case both with the Russian authorities at multilateral fora.
Bob Seeley.
Since the death of Alexei Navalny, does the government recognise the increased urgency of Vladimir Kara-Murz's case, as he is now the most high-profile living political prisoner in Russia? And what more is the government considering doing? And is the government working with our allies, such as the United States, in their dealings with a number of issues in this field?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for his supplementary question. Our ambassador raised Mr. Kara-Murz's case in person with Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister on 19th of January, repeating our request for consular access. The Foreign Secretary met with Mrs. Kara-Murza and Mr. Kara-Murz's mother, Eleanor Gordon, on the 1st of March, and we remain in close and regular contact with his family and legal representatives, and we will continue to keep this at the top of our agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Evan Gershkovich, was detained by the FSB almost exactly a year ago in March 29th, 2023. He is an American citizen, but he lives in the UK, works for the Wall Street Journal, and his continued detention is another stain on Russia. Although he isn't a British citizen, could the Minister tell me if he's conferring with his American colleagues to try and ensure that Mr. Gershkovich is released?
Yes, I'm happy to confirm that, and I'm happy also to seek an update from our head of mission in Moscow for her increased awareness.
Peter Grant.
Question 7.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 7 and 20 together. Israel must not undermine prospects for peace and security in the West Bank. As the occupying power, Israel must protect the civilian population.
Peter Grant.
The Minister forgot to mention that this is one rare occasion for the United Kingdom government has a long-standing position that Israel is acting unlawfully on the West Bank. 700,000 separate criminal acts of unlawful occupation endorsed and instructed by Benjamin Netanyahu. Because that illegal occupation has gone unpunished, we're now seeing extremists with the tacit acquiescence and sometimes direct support of the Israeli Defence Force committing acts of cold-blooded murder against innocent civilians. If they don't stand up to criminals, their crimes will get worse. The Minister has mentioned that 2 individuals have been sanctioned for their crimes in the West Bank. Why hasn't the President or the Prime Minister of Israel, who ordered that unlawful occupation, also been sanctioned?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government pursues its objectives, which I've set out very clearly to the House, in a way which I think is most likely to bring success. And perhaps I can just say, Mr. Speaker, that the 5 core asks, which are so relevant to many of the questions, are the release of all hostages, formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, removing Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel, Hamas no longer being in charge of Gaza, and with our allies we must provide serious practical and technical support for the Palestinian Authority. That is the approach which is most likely to command support, and not, I fear, the line that the honourable gentleman took.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Earlier the Minister said Israel's got a duty to protect civilians, but in the West Bank there's been 400 deaths, and there's now testimonies from Palestinian civilians in areas who have been subject to kidnapping, torture and abuse at the hands of Israeli settlers. This includes women and children. And yet the UK Government is only sanctioned 4 illegal settlers. So what further action is the UK Government going to take against settlers? And surely now, once and for all, is the time to ban trade of goods from these illegal settlements?
Well, I really don't think that would be a very sensible thing to do. But when it comes to sanctions, we do not comment across the floor of the House on who is about to be sanctioned or where the sanctions regime is going. But he may rest assured, Mr Speaker, that we keep these matters under very careful review.
Shadow Minister Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. As Ramadan begins and Passover and Easter approach, it's vital that all places of worship in Jerusalem be respected. I was extremely concerned by suggestions from Israeli Minister Ben-Gvir that restrictions could be imposed on worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque. I welcome subsequent statements by Israeli authorities that the sanctity of the holiday will be preserved. Authorities must show respect and restraint at this crucial moment. Has the government made this clear to Israeli counterparts that Minister Ben-Gvir's comments were unacceptable and inflamed tensions, and that the status quo arrangements must be maintained?
Well, Mr Speaker, she is entirely right about the importance of religious freedom, particularly in the circumstances which she so clearly set up. And she may rest assured that those are points which the British government makes very strongly to Israel, and it is helpful that the opposition and the government speak with one voice on that very important matter.
Question number 8, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I'll answer questions 8 and 10 together. The UK Government will always protect and promote the Falkland Islanders' right of self-determination. Only they can decide their own future. We want a good relationship with Argentina, but have been very clear that we will never negotiate away the islanders' democratic rights. And my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, reassured the islanders of our enduring commitment during his welcome visit to the Falkland Islands last month.
Cheryl Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I note that I'm currently the chair of the Overseas Territories APPG. I remember watching the ships leave the Tamar and head to the Falklands over 40 years ago from my constituency. In 1982, our Prime Minister, Maggie Thatcher, said, "Defeat, I do not recognise the meaning of the word." Does the government retain that steely resolve?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm young enough to remember those days as well. And yes, the UK Government remains steadfast in its resolve to ensure that the Falkland Islanders' right to self-determination is upheld, and will continue to use all diplomatic means to this end.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in recognising the efforts of the Falkland Islanders to build a modern, thriving community and economy? And does he agree with me that for as long as they wish to remain part of the British family, the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands will not be up for discussions?
Minister.
Well said. The modern, diverse, economically prosperous Falkland Islands of today is a testimony of the Falkland Islanders' achievements since the 1982 conflict. The Islanders are a valued part of the British family, and as long as they want to remain part of the family, sovereignty will not be up for discussion.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr Speaker, has the very commendable words that the Minister has made from the dispatch box today been relayed to the Argentinian authorities?
Minister.
As I said, we're working for good relations with Argentina, but they're very clear about our position in relation to the Falkland Islands.
Andrew Rossell.
Question 10, Mr Speaker.
9.
It's good to see my honourable friend in his place and continuing his strong interest in our overseas territories. The UK is committed to ensuring the security and good governance of the overseas territories and their peoples. We support improvements in institutions to ensure greater accountability, transparency and fairer societies.
Andrew Ross. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister will know that the 16 British overseas territories are cherished parts of the British family, and we rightly expect good governance from them in return for being part of our British family. However, isn't it also correct that it's time they were given some form of representation, some voice, not necessarily here in the British Parliament, but in institutions, maybe a committee of the House, where they can actually have a voice? Because at the moment, they have no representation in any sense. They aren't even allowed to be members of the Commonwealth, even as associate members. So will you look at this and see if the government can come up with a new approach to ensuring that our British overseas territories are fully represented?
I understand the point that he makes, and he obviously makes it with characteristic conviction. I think it's clear to say that the Foreign Affairs Committee is setting up a subcommittee which will engage the overseas territories more. And of course, I'm a strong voice, along with many other people here, for the overseas territories and will continue to be so going forward.
John McDonald.
Number 11, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are aware of British nationals who have died in Turkey following elective medical procedures, 28 since 2019, and that's why the UK government continues to engage very actively with the Turkish government on how to support the safety of patients who travel to Turkey for medical treatment.
John McNaught.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for that answer, and that's far too many people that have died. As we know, many gruesome deaths have occurred following cosmetic surgery in Turkey, including my own constituent, 28-year-old Shannon, whose family witnessed the most agonising, horrific death, where Shannon lay on a table for some 9 hours convulsing. Not once, as far as I'm aware, have Foreign Office ministers raised the issue with such needless deaths with Turkish government officials. And furthermore, I believe a pitiful byline of travel advice on the gov.uk website is simply not good enough. Will the Minister investigate an advertising suspension in collaboration with Cabinet colleagues and regulators regarding countries known for dangerous health tourism and a possible way of avoiding further deaths like Shannon?
Speaker, I'm grateful for the question, and this is raised with our Turkish counterparts at many levels. We will always look to see what more we can do, but the head of mission in Ankara is very seized of the urgency and the importance of this, and is therefore working in close collaboration with the Turkish authorities.
Nicola Rich.
16, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 16 and 17 together. We have been working tirelessly to secure the release of all hostages, including British nationals, since October the 7th.
Mr Speaker, last week the UN published their first report into the violence against women in Israel on 7th of October and against hostages. The report concluded rape, gang rape, genital mutilation was systematically used against Israeli women and girls. What adds another layer of heartbreak to the situation is that the victims that did survive do not trust the UN enough to speak to them about their experience. What will my right honourable friend do to urge the UN to make it a priority to rebuild this trust and tell the world that Me Too counts for Jews too?
Well, the world very much needs the United Nations, and I completely recognise the position which she so eloquently describes. We will do everything we can as a leading member, one of the P5 at the United Nations, to try and improve this relationship. And in respect of the appalling events she described on October the 7th, we are doing everything we can to try and help in the way that I set out to one of the honourable ladies opposite.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The hostages have been in captivity now for more than 100 days. It's estimated that of the 134 hostages still in captivity, the New York Times is reporting that 50 may have been killed. Given that there are 10 hostages who've been in captivity in Gaza of Israeli citizens for more than 10 years, does my right honourable friend agree with me that absolutely there must be a commitment to return the hostages before we can move to a humanitarian ceasefire?
Minister.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely correct, and he sets out the position extremely well. It is a top focus of the British government in all its parts to try and get these hostages back, as I have set out earlier in this session. The Prime Minister has called for the immediate release. The ICJ has called for their immediate release as well. And while I cannot give a running commentary on this, we are working closely with the US, Qatar, Egypt to secure their release.
Chair of the Committee, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 5 months, it's been the Israeli and Palestinian civilians who've taken the brunt of this conflict. We're only getting the slightest glimpse of the rape, the torture, the hostage-taking, the murder that's going on. So can the Minister tell us what is our own atrocity prevention team and preventing sexual violence team doing on the ground to document but also to stop this?
Well, we are very clear that we seek to document atrocities so that people can be held to account no matter how long it takes. And also, I mentioned earlier the additional funding specifically to help women who have been the subject of appalling sexual violence, as I set out to the House. But in respect of the issue of impunity, which she raised, and I'm very grateful to her and the Select Committee for their visit to the region. In respect of impunity, the position of the British Government is there can be no impunity.
The utter tragedy in the Middle East right now is that it is innocent civilians on both sides that are paying the price for failed politics and extremism. But I want to take the Minister back to his answer to the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where he said that Israel has the capacity to meet international law. So if he accepts it has the capacity, he's saying that they're not meeting that capacity, therefore they're in breach of international law, isn't he?
No, Mr. Speaker, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the current judgment of the British Government is that Israel has both the capacity and the intent to abide within international humanitarian law. It is an issue which we keep under review, as he will understand.
Come to Topicals, Miriam Fellows. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the question of Britain's priorities in Ukraine, in Gaza and across the world, the government is delivering. As the Munich Security Conference, the G20 in Brazil and in the UN, the Foreign Secretary has argued for standing by Ukraine as the invasion enters its third year. On Gaza, we are pressing with partners for a humanitarian pause and increase aid flows to Palestinian civilians. We've expanded the Blue Belt, defended shipping in the Red Sea and launched an innovative development partnership with Qatar. The International Development White Paper, Mr. Speaker, is being implemented across government and has been widely welcomed around the world.
Miriam Fellows.
Following recent events in Ukraine, what steps have been taken to speed up the process of releasing funds from the sale of Chelsea Football Club to support all victims of the war in Ukraine, wherever they are in the world?
But she is quite right, Mr. Speaker, that the time taken to release these funds is far too long, and there are significant complications addressing the release which involve the European Union and Portugal as well as Britain. But I can tell her that there is renewed energy to try to bring this matter to a head as swiftly as possible in the Foreign Office today.
Sir Michael
The International Atomic Energy Authority have recently made an assessment that uranium has been enriched in Iran enough to produce 3 atomic warheads. If this is true, what is the government's consideration regarding snapping back sanctions on Iran?
Minister.
These enrichment levels have no credible civilian justification. We're working with partners to ensure Iran never develops a nuclear weapon. We're prepared to use all diplomatic options, including triggering UN snapback if necessary, and we'll continue to monitor the situation very closely.
Shadow Minister Lindbrand.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Next month is the anniversary of a full year of unmitigated horror in Sudan. On Friday, the Security Council called for an immediate Ramadan ceasefire, and I know that our excellent diplomats and the Minister were pivotal in that resolution. The African Union, the Arab League, members across this House share that call, but the violence hasn't stopped. If the warring parties continue to refuse to listen, how can the government work with partners to step up the pressure?
Well, the Honourable Lady is quite right to raise the appalling position in Sudan, which to some extent has been masked by other terrible events in the world. She will be pleased to hear that, thanks to British leadership at the United Nations, a new Security Council resolution was passed, I believe, last Friday. And we are seeking to bring together all the different parties to try and make progress so that the next round of talks, possibly in Jeddah, will be more successful than the last. Britain condemns any arming of either party inside Sudan, and we are seeking also, through the work of our diplomatic mission in Khartoum, currently based in Addis, to help build civil society so that a political track can emerge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister's trade envoy to 4 key Latin American markets, I've seen first-hand the work that HMG and the UK private sector are doing to help the responsible extraction of key minerals like lithium. With the drive to net zero accelerating, these minerals will only become more important and competition is increasing. What diplomatic steps has the Department taken to strengthen the UK's security and economic relations in countries in Latin America?
Minister.
We're grateful for the outstanding work of our well-respected trade envoy. My honourable friend does amazing work. The trade and security are 2 central tenets of the UK's relationship with Latin America. Joining the CPTPP creates huge opportunities for businesses in Latin America and in the UK. And as my honourable friend is aware, sustainable, reliable, critical mineral supply chains are key, including lithium, and I look forward to meeting the Bolivian Vice President this afternoon.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Statehood is the inalienable right of Palestinian people and not in the gift of any neighbour. So would the Minister agree that no country has the right to veto the UK's recognition of a Palestinian state?
Mr. Speaker, the British government has always made it clear that it will recognise the Palestinian state when it thinks the time is right and such recognition would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Belarusian company Alutech have somehow managed to circumvent sanctions and set up in the UK in direct competition with their business partner, Dewsbury-based Alunet, who have had their turnover halved from 30 million to 15 million and shed jobs as a result of this unfair competition. Will the Minister agree to meet with me and directors of the company to discuss how we can resolve this terrible situation?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue. My honourable friend knows that some of our officials have indeed met the company concerned, and we are continuing to take action to close gaps between our Russia and Belarus sanctions, which we continue to keep under constant review. I would be very happy to meet with my honourable friend and to discuss the Belarus sanctions further.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have been clear that we must be bolder, seizing hundreds of billions of pounds of frozen Russian assets to support the Ukraine war effort. And we must get hold of the interest of those assets. And in February, the Prime Minister said, and then, with the G7, we must find lawful ways to seize the assets themselves and get those funds to Ukraine too. So can the Minister update the House on progress within the G7?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. He's right to ask, and we are making progress, but he's also right to point out that it needs to be lawful, and that's the key thing, and that's what we're working on.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister for Development and Africa update the House on his recent visit to Ethiopia, please?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question. I was recently in Ethiopia and I was able to visit Tigray and the edge of the most food insecure area, where the House will know that starvation and food shortage is rising alarmingly. I would describe the situation, Mr. Speaker, as if a football is being kicked at a plate glass window. We have the power to alter its trajectory, but if we don't, it will smash the plate glass window. And that is why Britain is setting up a pledging conference, working closely with the United Nations and setting up also a contact group on Ethiopia. And we are also, in the next financial year, increasing our bilateral funding very significantly.
Laura Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the world looks the other way, Sudan is suffering from a catastrophe. With 8 million people displaced, 15 million people with no health care whatsoever, 24 million people going hungry. What little aid there is not getting in, and all aid across the conflict lines has been suspended since last December. What efforts is the Minister making to advocate for additional crossing points for aid to get in Chad, in South Sudan and across the conflict line? And will he attend the aid conference in Paris next month?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do expect to attend that conference. I speak regularly to counterparts in the AU, UAE and Saudi Arabia. I spoke last night to Tom Perriello, the new US Special Envoy for Sudan, and we work very closely with IGAD and the Troika. We understand that the violence in Darfur bears all the hallmarks of ethnic cleansing, and we are funding an open-source organisation, the Centre for Information Resilience, to keep account of those events, and so that there can be no impunity in that respect either.
And agree that in order to see Palestinian self-determination, we need an end to human rights abuses, anti-Semitism and the glorification of violence, and Palestinians free from Hamas.
We certainly agree with his last point about Palestine free from Hamas. There is no place for Hamas in the future government of Palestine. In respect of the point that he makes about how we proceed further, the government is absolutely clear that there is no place in our society, or anywhere else for that matter, for Islamophobia or anti-Semitism.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israeli Minister Benny Gantz is the only person to have been granted a special mission status certificate by the Foreign Office since the beginning of last year, effectively protecting him from arrest for his part in suspected breaches of international law. According to reports, Israel did not grant Gantz's delegation official status. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister explain why the UK government still chose to provide diplomatic cover for this individual?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, whatever the position of the Israeli government, let me assure him that Benny Gantz was received in this country. He was seen by the Foreign Secretary and his visit was most welcome.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will know that European security continues to be underpinned by the USA, which funds the vast majority of the NATO budget. Could I please ask him what is being done to coerce more of our NATO allies to meet their 2% commitment? And does he agree that European nations must shoulder more of the burden for our own security for good strategic reasons?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I do agree that we must put our money where our mouths are. But in this 75th anniversary of NATO, as we survey the landscape of European and Atlantic security, we see, with the exception of Finland and Sweden, that NATO is in very good order indeed.
John Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I acknowledge what the Minister of State said about sanctioning certain West Bank settlers, although 4 seems a very low number to me. Has he raised the activities of those settlers with his opposite number in the Israeli government?
The British government has certainly raised those activities with the Israeli government, and that is why we have asked that they should be arrested, prosecuted and punished for those activities. In respect of those who may or may not be subject to a sanctions regime, we keep that fully under review, but he'll understand why I think it's best not to discuss it across the floor of the House.
So David Davis.
Has any Foreign Office minister, Foreign Office official or embassy member had any discussions with our American allies over this dysfunctional extradition treaty since the disgraceful end of the Secoulis case?
Minister.
My right honourable friend asks an extremely good question. He and I have cooperated on this matter many times in the past. If he was so good as to table a question on this matter, I will make sure that immediately he gets a full answer to that question.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when Jeffrey Sachs, a UN advisor and from a Jewish American family, incidentally, says on camera, Israel has deliberately starved the people of Gaza, I'm not using exaggeration, I'm literally talking about starving the population. Israel is a criminal, it is in non-stop war crime status now. I believe in genocidal status, and without shame, without remorse, without truth and without insight of what it's doing, and adds, this is a murderous gang in government right now, they are zealots. Does that not give the UK government pause to reflect on the funding of UNRWA, the call for a ceasefire and the recognition of Palestine, which 138 of 193 UN member states have done, rather than see it wiped off the map?
Mr. Speaker, I think almost nothing that the honourable gentleman has just said could possibly be deemed helpful in trying to bring the two sides together, achieve a pause, get the hostages out, get aid in and receive a sustainable ceasefire. And so therefore I'm afraid I am unable to offer any reassurance on any of the points that he made.
Mr. Speaker, last week 287 children aged between 5 and 12 were kidnapped from their school in Nigeria. That comes on top of 8,000 Christians who were killed for their faith last year. What are we doing about it?
He is right about these appalling events, and the High Commission in Abuja has raised these matters. Also, our honourable friend, who is responsible for freedom of religion and belief, regularly focuses on what is happening in Nigeria and makes representations. And this ensures, too, that the Foreign Office is kept up to the mark in pursuing it.
Williams. Speaker, Canada's to resume funding of UNRWA, having received UN reports. Has the UK government received such reports? Are they being reviewed? When will that review be concluded and the decision be made?
Well, we are asking, Mr. Speaker, that that we have an interim report on both the key reports as soon as possible, and we will look at those reports as soon as they arrive and make our decisions accordingly. But during the course of this question session, I have adumbrated both those who are supporting the same position as the UK and those who are restoring immediate funding. But he will want to bear in mind that Britain has fully funded UNRWA for its share up into the next financial year.
Chair of the Committee, Alicia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Haiti is on the edge of collapse. Only 100 nautical miles away is Turks and Caicos, for which the UK has responsibility for its national security. Will the Foreign Office therefore fulfil its role and request from the MOD and the Home Office that we deploy HMS Trent for defensive and surveillance capabilities, deploy Royal Marine fast boats, provide assets monitoring in the sea lane, and increase the policing footprint in TCI? Too often we have acted too slowly, and that has in the past resulted in threats to remove TCI from our overseas family. Please, can we act now?
Minister.
I can assure my honourable friend that I was recently in TCI and understand the situation there. We've seen a rise in numbers of people making that dangerous journey by sea from Haiti to TCI. We've been able to put in place 13 serious crime investigators, 7 firearm officers, and we're working with the Home Office and the MOD in building capability and capacity building in this very important situation.
Mike Ainsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened very carefully, as I always do, to what the Minister said in regards to calls for a immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It's now time to step up, Minister. It does require all warring parties to stop. That's the rockets, the bombs, the bullets. Exactly right, and for the hostages to be released. But sure, that would send a very strong signal if the UK government calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire now.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for what he has said. He will have heard the 5 key priorities that the British government has put on the table, and I'm very grateful to him for his agreement. This cross-party support is extremely helpful in driving forward an imperative which Britain feels very strongly.
Andrew Rosenthal.
Mr. Speaker, will His Majesty's government make the strongest possible diplomatic protest against the new draconian national security laws being imposed on the good people of Hong Kong? And does he accept that Britain still has a moral responsibility to the people of Hong Kong who have been loyal to this country for so many years?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an important point, and we continue to raise our concerns about the breaches of the Sino-British Declaration, which we see this new layer of legislation coming through with the National Security Law. We consider to continue in breach, then we continue to ask for those laws to be removed.
Final question, Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that the alleged detention, beatings, humiliations of 49 Palestinian medics at the Nasser hospital last month needs to be investigated by the ICC? Yes or no?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this session ends with the same question with which it started. As I set out, we believe there must be accountability, and we have made that clear to the Israeli authorities.
That completes questions. Let the front bench change over.